We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio. Continuing our discussion on affirmative action at the Supreme Court, we're fortunate enough to be joined by a Liberty Nation author, general man about town, and founder of all things wonderful and wise, Mr. Jeff Charles. Thanks for being here, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. That was quite an intro.
Oh, they get better. The more times you appear on the show, the better the introductions get. It's our way of encouraging you to come back. You should see what I've got lined up for Scott D. Cosenza next week. Now, Jeff, affirmative action, 2 cases at the Supreme Court. What are your general thoughts on affirmative action as a Black conservative?
Yeah, generally, I'm not a huge fan of it. I understand why it was implemented in the first place, and back then it was probably more necessary. In 2022, I'm not convinced that this is really moving the needle forward for the Black community. I think Black students and Black Americans in general, there are other things that we could be doing and pushing for that would actually help us move forward. So I think at this point, in a lot of areas, it's doing more harm than good.
How so do you mean the harm, though? I think we may have touched on this briefly with Scott D. Cosenza earlier in the show, but in what way do you see it as potential harm?
So a lot of people highlight the fact that it discriminates against whites and Asians. And, that is racial discrimination, but it also hurts the people, just like with most progressive policies, it hurts the people that it's supposed to protect the most. So, for example, like I read earlier, that the cases that are going to be before the Supreme Court, and when it comes to affirmative action in general, when it comes to universities, it doesn't actually have as big an impact as it seems. These decisions will impact schools like Harvard, Brown, or other Ivy League schools who are more selective about who they allow to attend. They have fewer seats with a bigger number of applicants. That's not the case for normal universities. But what happens is that when they prioritize race over proficiency, they end up bringing in Black students based on their skin color, but not necessarily on their proficiency. And then in a lot of cases, probably even in most cases, those Black students end up failing or flunking out because they weren't at the level of standards that a school like Harvard would demand. Whereas if they went to a different institution that maybe didn't have the same level of clout, they may get a same level of education, or at least close to it, but it's more tailored towards their skill level, and they can continue to develop it from there, rather than just throwing them into the deep end of the pond when they're not able to swim in it.
I think the issue and the reason for the competitiveness at these top schools, you say Harvard, Yale, Brown, Cleveland, or all these top schools. I don't know if Cleveland is a top school. I was just guessing. But I think what the difference is that if you go to a top tier university and then you go to an Ivy League university, I think what you find is that there's an exponential difference in career earnings and career progression. So it's a chalice to be sought, as it were, because
yes,
although you're getting roughly equivalent the same education, it provides extra opportunities for you. Now, I think that's really what the situation is. There's a lot of Asian kids who've worked their whole lives, and they're kind of missing out on these top jobs or top pay grades, essentially, that they'd be wanting. So you think that it's detrimental in some way? When Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson was first nominated for the Supreme Court, there was a big controversy about people saying that she would forever have an asterisk next to her name. Mm-hmm. The workload at these universities must be immense. So if you've passed, right?
Well, and this is where it gets a little murky. There is merit to that argument. And you're right. I mean, having Harvard on your resume is going to grant you more clout than not having it. But going to Harvard and then flunking out, that's not going to give you any clout whatsoever.
Sure.
But when it comes to the asterisks, now I don't think that that's going to apply to Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Jackson Brown, because obviously, I mean, if you've made it to the level where you're being nominated for the Supreme Court, you've accomplished quite a lot in your life. Yeah. But that does apply. It does apply. That stigma does apply to other areas. And I've spoken with other Black conservatives who specialize in affirmative action, and one of them even told me, like, he was an affirmative action, not hire, but enrollee, and he talked about how people would straight up say, "You're just here because of your race," even though he was perfectly suited for it, he was perfectly competent, he still got that label. And to me, it kind of pushes another form of racism. I mean, when people refer to others as an affirmative action hire, they did the same thing with former Republican National Committee head Michael Steele. And when he fell out of favor. So it does provide that issue. Now, I think that's a lesser problem than putting a student in a college that he's not ready for, or he or she, I should say. I don't want to get in trouble.
Of course. Or them.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a lesser issue, but it's still an issue. And then when it comes to Asian students, and I don't know if have been studies about this, but with the Asian students who may have missed out on going to Harvard, or at least going that year, did they actually lose out on job opportunities? Did it affect their finances? I don't know the answer to that question. What I know is that it's not right to base your decision on race.
Well, I think that's what it comes down to at the end. I mean, that's really the question before the court in at least the first case, the Harvard case. Whether they can discriminate based on the color of somebody's skin. Now, I want to get into the political aspect, Jeff, because that's where I always enjoy talking to you. Mm-hmm. What do you think the fallout will be? Now, Scott DeCasenta, who we spoke with earlier in the show, he thinks that it's quite likely that affirmative action is done for a couple of reasons. First, you've got at least 5 justices who one of which, Justice Clarence Thomas, has written extensively against affirmative action. You've got Justice Neil Gorsuch, who, although he gets in disfavor for it, tries to stick to a strict, this is the letter of the law. And the letter of the law is that you can't discriminate based on race. So there's a good chance that it will fall, affirmative action will fall. What's the political fallout?
Yeah, it's going to be wild. And I agree with Scott. I think it is going to fall. And this will be just like abortion was, this will be another issue that Democrats use to galvanize their base. I don't know if it'll be enough for that, because in reality, it's not going to affect as many people. In fact, affirmative action has actually benefited white women more than it has Black people. So I believe that they're going to use this to make political hay. They'll do a good job of it. I mean, everything that they do is based on race, and they're going to portray this as something that's just going to devastate the Black community and set Black people back for decades, even though realistically it won't. But that is what they'll do with it, and the activist media will be on board with it. And, after a few months, people will forget about it.
Yeah, same with everything that happens. Do you think that a Democrat-led Congress, if such a thing is going to exist after November this year, do you think that they would try, as they are promising to do with Roe v. Wade, and try and codify some form of affirmative action into law, essentially by recrafting the law as it's written, where it says that discrimination based on race is illegal? Do you think they'll say, unless these certain things apply? Do you think there'll be a recrafting that they at least offer to the people, perhaps in the 2024 run-up?
Well, they should, if they want to be consistent with what they say, but it's the same thing. When Democrats say certain things to Black people or make promises or exploit Black people to further their political ends, they don't actually want to actually solve the problem. So I don't believe for a second that they're going to try to codify it if they manage to maintain control of either chamber. They may make some overtures in that direction, but they're not, like with abortion, they actually tried to pass something knowing that it wasn't going to pass. I don't even think that they'll do that with affirmative action, because to them, these issues are simply political footballs that they use to get votes. And actually, I predict that if they make big hay about this in the media, but they don't try to pass some type of legislation and make an actual concerted effort, that's going to push Black people even further away, because now it's further proof that they've been lying to us for decades.
From Jeff's lips to God's ear. Jeff Charles, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's almost all we have time for on today's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'd like to just thank our guests, Scott D. Cosenza and Jeff Charles, for taking the time to join us. And of course, you, the listeners, for tuning in. Instead of giving you my final thoughts for the week, I'll leave that to a thinker I'm sure we all appreciate, Mr. Thomas Sowell, who wrote, quote, "However much history may be invoked in support of these policies, no policy can apply to history, but can only apply to the present or the future. The past may be many things, but it is clearly irrevocable. Its sins can no more be purged than its achievements be expunged. Those who suffered in centuries past are as much beyond our help as those who sinned are beyond our retribution." End quote. Something to think about there. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.